December 24, 1858. Christmas Eve in Savannah, Georgia. The Palmetto Creek estate stood proud on stolen earth, its grand house trimmed with pine and holly, its windows spilling golden light into the winter dusk. To the neighbors, it was an image of abundance, a monument to southern gentility. To those who lived in chains behind its kitchens and beneath its fields, it was a fortress of cruelty dressed in ribbons and prayers. The masters of Palmetto Creek delighted in ceremony. Tonight they prayed over the feast, thanking God for blessings, for wealth, for family. They spoke of Bethlehem while men still limped from yesterday's lashes. They sang hymns of peace while the iron shackles in the quarters rattled with every restless breath. Christmas here was not a night of grace, it was a theatre of power, a season where hypocrisy rang louder than bells. The kitchen had been Rachel's world for 14 years. She was 30 now, born in bondage on another estate and sold south when she was 16. The kitchen was both her prison and her battlefield, sweat dripping from her brow into steaming pots, flames licking her arms with burns that never healed smooth. She commanded her tools with precision knife, pestle, spoon, her weapons and her chains. From her hands came the roasts and sauces that crowned the big house table. From her silence came the survival of her people. But Rachel was not only a cook. She was a reader. It had been years ago with a hymn book, pages torn and discarded when the spine cracked. She hid those scraps beneath her apron, tracing the black ink by firelight, matching shapes to whispered sounds. Letters became words, words became verses. Verses became knowledge, and knowledge became a secret fire. She could not speak of it, not even to Eli, the man she loved, but the words gave her strength. They told her that truth was older than chains, that even Egypt's yoke had broken one day. The house that evening shone with polished wood and brass. Garlands hung heavy on the stair rails, candles flickered against silver trays, and a polished piano sang under the mistress's clumsy fingers. The air was thick with roasted goose, sugared ham, nutmeg, and cloves. Guests from neighboring estates crowded the parlor, their laughter swelling like a storm of false joy. They had brought fine coats of wool, dresses of silk and velvet, children in ribbons who were ushered past Rachel and the others as though past furniture. Rachel moved between the kitchen and the dining hall, bearing trays with the silent grace she had mastered. But silence did not shield her. When one dish arrived a shade too cool, delayed not by her, but by the mistress's endless scolding. The master stopped the feast. His voice was smooth as polished oak, carrying just enough amusement to entertain his peers. "Rachel," he said, drawing her forward as one might call for a hound, "bring that plate here." She obeyed. The roast pheasant, glazed and garnished, weighed heavy in her arms. "On your knees." The command struck the hall like a bell. Conversations hushed, forks clattered gently onto porcelain. The mistress smiled, thin and cold. Rachel lowered herself, the polished wood pressing hard against her bones. She held the dish up like an offering to an altar. "Now," the master continued, "beg forgiveness for failing the table. Speak clearly, so all may hear." It was not her mistake. She knew it, and so did he. But the performance was the point. To remind the guests that mastery meant not only labor extracted, but dignity stripped away. Rachel's mouth was dry, her heart pounding with a force that almost made the dish shake. She bowed her head to hide the fury burning in her eyes. The words came quiet, measured, carved from her pride. "Forgive me, sir. I beg your pardon." Laughter broke around the hall, rich and cruel. One guest dabbed his lips with a silk cloth and muttered, "See how well trained." Another, a planter's wife, whispered, "Obedience is the finest spice." The master waved his hand as though dismissing a dog. "Rise, serve again. Do better." Rachel rose. The plate was heavy, but not as heavy as the shame. She walked back toward the kitchen, her steps even, her face blank. Yet inside, something shifted. Not snapped, not broken, shifted, like earth before an earthquake. In the kitchen, the heat swallowed her. The fire roared, pots hissed, knives struck wood with steady rhythm. Yet Rachel heard none of it clearly. The humiliation still rang in her ears, as sharp as a whip crack. Her hands moved with practiced speed, but her mind was elsewhere, on the words she had read in the scraps of scripture, words of plagues, of deliverance, of justice that fell sudden and unanswerable. She thought of the quarters outside, where children huddled in the cold, too hungry to dream. She thought of the fields, where the older men coughed blood into their hands and kept hoeing until their bodies dropped. She thought of her own back, the scars long faded but still alive under her skin. Christmas, they called it. The birth of hope, yet here it was nothing but the sharpening of chains. Rachel kept stirring, kept cutting, kept plating. She said nothing, but every sound, the clatter of glasses, the laughter from the hall, the cruel echo of "beg forgiveness," wove itself into the storm forming quietly in her chest. Tonight she would endure, tonight she would bow. But the memory of her knees pressed to the polished floor would not leave her. It would follow her like a shadow, and when the hour came, it would be the ember that set fire to everything. Eli was the one brightness that had ever pierced Rachel's long nights of smoke and silence. He was 32, a carpenter by trade, his hands shaped by wood and iron, his back bent by labor, yet still proud. Where others had been broken into silence, Eli still carried a spark in his eyes, a kind of stubborn steadiness, a belief that though the world had chained him, it had not conquered him. They met by accident in the small yard behind the smokehouse. Rachel had been carrying buckets of water when her foot slipped in the mud. The pail fell, splashing her skirt. Eli, passing with a length of timber on his shoulder, set it down and helped her to her feet. Their eyes met just for a moment, but something lingered. From then on, each found small excuses to pass the other. Rachel at the well, Eli repairing a fence, both pretending not to look but always seeing. Love in bondage was not like love in freedom. It was not courted with flowers or serenades. It was built from fragments, a glance, a whispered word while passing, a shared crust of bread stolen from the kitchen, a brief touch in the shadows when no overseer watched. To love was to risk. But Rachel risked, and Eli did too, because even the smallest ember of tenderness could hold back the frost of despair. On Christmas week, Rachel's heart lived in double measure, in the heat of her kitchen, and in the fear that shadowed every step Eli took. For weeks, whispers had circled. The master, drowning in gambling debts, had decided to sell Eli after the holidays. To him, Eli was not a man, not a craftsman whose hands had built porches and staircases. He was a price, a figure, a number in a ledger. Rachel heard the plan in fragments while serving wine. The master's voice carried through the parlor. "The carpenter's still young enough, strong. We'll fetch a fine sum for him in Charleston." The mistress's voice, sharp and amused. "Yes, after Christmas. I won't have the bull disrupted by such business. Let him build the platform for the musicians first." Their guests laughed. That night Rachel told Eli what she had overheard. They stood near the barn, the winter wind biting through their thin clothes. She kept her voice low, her hands gripping his as if they could anchor him here. "They mean to sell you," she whispered. "After the holidays. They said Charleston." Eli nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. "I heard some of it," he admitted. "Thought it was rumor. Thought maybe it'd pass." Rachel shook her head. "They mean it. They spoke of debts, of prices." He pulled her close, his forehead resting against hers. "If they take me, there's no coming back." Rachel's chest tightened, her breath catching. She wanted to say they would run, but she knew the truth. Palmetto Creek was too closely watched, too deep in the web of marshes and roads patrolled day and night. 2 runaways had been caught last year before they reached the river. Their bodies had been left hanging in the yard for 3 days, a warning no one could forget. Escape was not impossible, but it was near enough to suicide. "Then we must find another way," Rachel said. Her voice trembled, but in her eyes burned a steadiness that Eli recognized. He kissed her brow, his rough hand brushing her cheek before slipping back into the shadows. The days that followed grew heavier with cruelty. As though preparing for Eli's sale, the overseers pressed the enslaved harder, punishing for the smallest errors. A child who stumbled while carrying water was struck with the back of a hand. An old man who paused too long in the field was whipped until his shirt was nothing but tatters. The lash sang almost daily, a grim carol that underlined the Christmas hymns drifting from the big house. For Rachel, the humiliation in the hall still ached like an open wound. But now a deeper wound throbbed, the certainty that Eli would be torn from her, perhaps forever. The masters spoke of it openly, careless of who overheard. Once Rachel carried a tray of candied fruit into the parlor, and the mistress smiled at her with sugar-sweet venom. "Don't fret, girl," she said loudly, making sure all could hear. "You'll learn to live without him, and you'll soon learn a proper lesson in obedience yourself." Guests chuckled. One man added with a smirk, "Best teacher in the yard, nothing straightens a woman faster." Rachel bowed, eyes lowered, but her fists clenched so tight, her nails cut her palms. She left the room without a word, yet the words had already carved themselves into her. 2 days before Christmas, the sale came sooner than promised. A wagon arrived before dawn. Rachel had risen early to begin the day's baking when she heard the sound of chains clinking outside. She ran to the kitchen door just in time to see Eli pushed forward, his hands bound, his face bloodied from a blow. "Wait!" Rachel cried, forgetting herself. She rushed a step forward, but a guard shoved her back with the butt of his musket. Eli met her eyes just for a moment, his lips split, his cheek swollen, but his gaze was steady. "Rachel," he called, voice hoarse but unbroken. "Remember." Then the wagon door slammed, whips cracked, the wheels rolled, and Eli was gone. Rachel stood frozen, her apron damp with flour and tears. Around her, the kitchen clattered with its endless demands, pots boiling, knives chopping, the mistress's voice already calling for coffee. But Rachel heard nothing, only the echo of Eli's voice, that single word, "remember." She realized then what she had always known in some hidden corner of her heart. Escape was impossible. They had tightened every chain, patrolled every path, built walls not of stone but of fear. She could not break those walls with flight. But there was one place where she still held power. One place no overseer could watch every moment, no master could imagine betrayal, the kitchen. Every day she handled the sauces, the wines, the herbs. She knew which leaves soothed and which clouded, which roots cured and which burned. The masters had never imagined that the hands that fed them might also carry their judgment. Rachel wiped her face with her apron, her tears leaving pale streaks in the flour. Her chest still heaved with grief, but grief was hardening into resolve. She would not flee. She would not plead. She would not bow again. She would use what she had always held in her hands: fire, knife, herb, and cup. And when she struck, it would not be with rage alone, but with justice served at the very table where they had forced her to kneel. Christmas night at Palmetto Creek was the grandest spectacle of the year. From early morning, carriages rattled along the muddy road, bringing neighbors in velvet and lace. Lanterns burned bright along the drive, their glow reflecting off frost-tipped branches. By dusk, the house swelled with bodies and laughter, its walls vibrating with the noise of 100 voices raised in cheer. For the enslaved, the day was a storm. Rachel directed the kitchen with machine-like precision, her voice firm but low as she assigned tasks. One boy tending the fires, 2 girls polishing silver, an older woman whisking eggs until her wrists trembled. Dishes piled higher than altars, roasted goose stuffed with herbs, hams glistening under honey glaze, bowls of candied yams, platters of oysters simmered in cream, tureens of spiced soup. Wine flowed into cut glass, cider steamed in silver pitchers. To the guests, it was a vision of abundance. To those who labored, it was chains polished bright enough to blind. Rachel moved among it all like a conductor, yet her mind was elsewhere, focused, cold, waiting. Eli's absence gnawed at her, but she carried his last word like iron. Remember. Tonight memory sharpened into a blade. Tonight she would strike. She began by watching. The masters believed her invisible, a servant too bound to notice their routines. But Rachel noticed everything. She knew that the master always took wine from the second decanter, the one with etched vines along its side. She knew the mistress preferred her cider warmed. Sipped slowly between bites of sugared cake, she knew which guests reached greedily for oysters, which demanded extra slices of ham, which lifted their glasses with careless haste. Each preference was a weakness, each habit a door left unlocked. From the storeroom, Rachel had gathered the ingredients days earlier. dried leaves of water hemlock, a powder ground from oleander, a bitter root steeped in vinegar until it released its silent fire. They were not unfamiliar to her. Generations before had carried such knowledge across the ocean, medicine and poison intertwined, healing and vengeance written in the same green script. Her own mother had whispered some of it before she was sold, and Rachel had remembered. She always remembered. That afternoon, while the kitchen bustled, Rachel slipped small portions of the mixture into hidden vessels. A cloth packet tucked under a stack of plates, a vial bound in linen inside her apron, another folded into the hem of her skirt. No one noticed. To them, she was only Rachel the cook, bustling, scolding, sweating as always. When the first courses went out, platters, borne by trembling hands into the glittering hall, Rachel followed with pitchers. She swapped them deftly, one filled with untainted cider for her own people in the serving line, another carrying the poisoned mixture destined for the masters. The scents of cinnamon and nutmeg masked the bitterness perfectly. No guest suspected. At every chance, she whispered warnings. To the scullery boy carrying bread, "Don't drink, don't taste." To the two girls polishing trays, "Keep the children in the barn." To the blacksmith, towering and watchful in the yard, "When I give the sign, be ready." None asked questions. They knew enough to obey. Their eyes flickered with fear, with wonder, with something older than both hope. The feast reached its height. Laughter swelled like thunder, glasses clinked, forks scraped silver. Rachel moved silently among them, pouring, refilling, clearing plates. Each step felt like a drumbeat, counting toward an unseen hour. She watched the first signs carefully, a guest pausing mid-sentence, rubbing his temple, another coughing after a sip of wine, the mistress dabbing her lips with sudden pallor in her cheeks. The poison spread quietly, invisibly, weaving through the hall like smoke. Then the panic began. A man lurched from his chair, knocking over his goblet. Another clutched his throat, face reddening. The mistress gasped, her hand trembling as the spoon fell from her fingers. All around, voices rose in alarm. "Water!" someone shouted. "Doctor!" another cried. But no cure waited in those gilded walls. Rachel stood at the edge of the room, her tray steady, her face calm. To the masters, she was still only a servant frozen by fear. But to her people, hidden in the shadows of the hall, her stillness was a signal. She gave the nod. The blacksmith and his men moved like thunder. Chains meant to bind now smashed locks. Iron meant to shackle now broke open doors. Guards rushed forward but were disarmed. Their muskets wrested away, their blades turned aside. Papers, sale ledgers, contracts, debts were seized and thrown into the fire. Flames devoured them, each crackle erasing a transaction of flesh. The hall was chaos, guests staggering, some collapsing silent, others moaning as the poison worked its way deeper. Servants fled in terror, gowns rustling, boots slipping on the polished floor. Outside, the yard filled with shouts and the ringing of iron on iron. Rachel remained steady, her tray still in hand, her eyes fixed not on the dying, but on the living on the people she had warned, the children she had hidden, the men now breaking free. This was not slaughter for its own sake. This was justice carved from necessity, vengeance woven with survival. By midnight, the laughter of Palmetto Creek had fallen silent. Only the crackle of fire and the low murmur of freed voices remained. The grand house, once filled with arrogance and song, now smelled of smoke, spilled wine, and something heavier, the final reckoning of pride. Rachel set her tray down at last. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from release. She had turned her kitchen into a weapon, her obedience into a mask, her grief into a blade sharper than any whip. She did not smile, but in her chest she felt something close to breath after drowning. The night was not finished. Dawn would come, and with it men bearing GNs, law, and rope. But tonight, for the first time, Palmetto Creek belonged not to its masters, but to those who had built it with their blood. And at the center of it all stood Rachel, the cook, the reader, the woman who had remembered. Dawn crept slowly over Savannah, painting the horizon with pale strokes of gray and gold. At Palmetto Creek, the air was thick with smoke and silence. The night's chaos had burned itself into the bones of the estate. Overturned chairs in the dining hall, shattered glass crunching beneath boots, spilled wine drying black on the floor. The grand house, once so proud, smouldered in corners where candles had tipped and curtains caught fire. The flames had licked the walls, but not consumed them. The enslaved had rushed in, throwing water, smothering sparks with blankets, fighting not to destroy, but to save what was now theirs. In the yard, chains lay broken on the ground, twisted links glinting in the first light. Men and women gathered in clusters, their faces weary but unbowed. Children peered from the barn, wide-eyed, clutching one another, too young to understand the full weight of what had happened, but old enough to know they were no longer silent property. The blacksmith, his arms blackened with soot, stood watch at the gate with a hammer in hand. The guards who had once barked orders now sat bound under the oak, their heads lowered in stunned disbelief. Rachel moved among her people quietly, her apron singed, her hands streaked with ash. She had not slept. She had not needed to. Her body was taut with purpose, her eyes lit with a fire that even grief could not quench. She directed those who carried buckets, comforted children with a touch, steadied the trembling shoulders of the young men who had fought hardest. Her voice, usually reserved for the kitchen, carried across the yard with calm authority. Keep the little ones in the barn till it's safe. Pour water on the roof beams, they still smoke. Lay the sick on blankets by the stable, keep them in the shade. Her commands were simple, practical, but each one wove a pattern. For the first time the estate moved under a different order, not that of the master, but of Rachel. By mid-morning the fires were out. The yard was steady, and then from the distance the sound came. The drumming of hooves, the clatter of wheels, the harsh barking of dogs. The sheriff was coming. With him rode armed men from neighboring estates, summoned by rumors that had flown faster than dawn. The massacre at Palmetto Creek, poison, rebellion, chaos had already become story, twisted and retold, but all versions agreed on one thing. Order had been broken and blood demanded answer. The enslaved gathered at the gates, some gripped farm tools like weapons, others clutched nothing at all, only their fear. But Rachel stepped forward, her face calm. She held in her hands not a blade, but a length of white cloth tied to a stick. She raised it high, gasps rippled through her. People, was it surrender? But Rachel's voice cut through, strong and unwavering. This is not their flag. This is ours. This says, we will be heard. She planted it in the ground before the gate. The cloth stirred in the wind, pale against the dark pines. It was not a sign of defeat, but of defiance, a demand, not a plea. The sheriff's party arrived with thunder. Horses stamped, rifles glinted, dogs strained against their leashes. The sheriff himself was a thick man with a red face and eyes sharp from years of fear disguised as law. He surveyed the yard, the bound guards, the smouldering house, the white cloth raised high. "What's this madness?" he bellowed. "Who leads this?" Rachel stepped forward. She wiped her hands on her scorched apron and raised her chin. "I do." The sheriff's lip curled. "You admit it, then? You poisoned them? You raised rebellion?" Rachel's voice was clear. "I did. I alone." A murmur swept through the yard. Some of her people started to protest, but she raised her hand to silence them. Her eyes never left the sheriff's. "I served them their last supper. I gave the word. If there is blame, it is mine." The sheriff spat in the dirt. "You'll hang for this, woman." Rachel's gaze did not falter. "Then hang me. But know this, I did not beg for mercy when I was forced to my knees in that hall. I will not beg now. I did this for justice, not obedience." The men behind the sheriff shifted uneasily. Some had come eager for blood, expecting rage and chaos, but what they faced was a woman standing unarmed, her voice steady, her back straight. Not a rioter, but something larger, an embodiment of all the silence, all the humiliation, all the memory they had tried to bury. The sheriff barked orders. Rachel was seized, her wrists bound in coarse rope, yet she walked without stumbling, without pleading. Her people watched, silent, their eyes burning. She met their gaze once, just once, and mouthed a single word: "Remember." The trial came swiftly, as all such trials did. In Savannah's courthouse, she was paraded like spectacle. Crowds filled the benches, eager to see the cook who had turned her kitchen into a battlefield. Newspapers called her deranged, a devil's handmaid. Preachers thundered of Satan's work, of women forgetting their place. The prosecutor listed the dead by name, painting each as an innocent victim of monstrous cunning. Rachel stood alone in the dock, her hands bound, her body weary but unbroken. She spoke only once, when the judge demanded an explanation. Her voice rang through the chamber, calm, unshaken. They taught me obedience, but I learned justice. They broke my body, but not my memory. They said I was nothing, but tonight you remember my name. That is enough. The jury deliberated only minutes. Guilty. Sentence, death by hanging. The crowd murmured approval, but in the back rows, whispers began low, steady, dangerous. Whispers not of madness, but of courage, not of crime, but of justice. Rachel heard them, and she smiled, just faintly, for the first time in many years. When the day of execution came, she walked to the gallows with her head high. The rope hung waiting, the crowd gathered like vultures. The sheriff read her sentence aloud. He asked if she had last words. Rachel raised her voice so all could hear. You may cull the body, but the memory walks free. The trap gave way. The crowd gasped, and for a moment it seemed she did not fall but rose like smoke from the kitchen fire, like a story carried on wind, like a seed too stubborn to die. After Rachel's body was cut down, the officials buried her in unmarked ground beyond the city limits. No hymn, no stone, no name. They believed silence would finish what the rope had begun. But silence is never empty, it carries. In the quarters, whispers began that very night. Someone had smuggled out the scraps of paper Rachel once kept hidden under her pallet, lines copied from scripture, words she had written in her careful hand. Simple sentences, but they burned like coals. Justice is not obedience. Chains can be broken. Remember Rachel. The scraps passed hand to hand, then memory to memory, until even those who had never seen her face could recite her words. On plantations across Georgia, the story grew. Some said she poisoned only a few, others swore the whole Christmas table had fallen. Details shifted, but the heart of it never changed. Rachel had risen, had struck back with the very tools she was forced to wield, had walked to the gallows without lowering her head. Mothers whispered her name to children as they braided their hair. So they would know courage was possible. Men in the fields hummed songs that carried her memory, low and steady like heartbeat. In northern cities, abolitionist circles caught the tale. Letters spoke of the Savannah cook who defied her masters. Newspapers twisted it into sensationalism, warning slaveholders to guard their kitchens. But between the lines, some readers saw something else. Proof that the enslaved did not wait passively for freedom, but carved it where they could. With blade, with fire, with pen, with poison. The Palmetto Creek estate was broken up within a year. Its debts could not be mended, its reputation could not be washed clean. The land was sold, the house stripped of its finery, its name cursed in whispers even among planters. But Rachel's name outlived the estate. She became a story told in secret, not villain, not victim, but warning and beacon both. Generations later, when no marker remained, the phrase still lingered. Remember Rachel, not on monuments of stone, but in voices, in songs, in the stubborn fire of those who refused to forget. Rachel had been a cook, a servant, a woman forced to her knees before her masters. In death, she became something greater, a sign that no humiliation lasts forever, that even the most silent hands may one day turn and strike. And so her story did not end at the gallows. It walked on in whispers, in songs, in memory that would not die.